Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Adventures in Brain Injury podcast. My name is Kaplan. I'm a severe traumatic brain injury survivor, host of the Adventures in Brain Injury podcast, and author of How to Feed a Brain, Nutrition for Optimal Brain Function and Repair. I'm currently on the road, and I got myself a new road boat, as I call it, and I am currently in Boise, Idaho. And I am so excited to be having a conversation with Julia Rucklidge, who is an amazing. I met Julia through Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, and we did an interview with Bonnie Kaplan a year, maybe 2 years ago. And Julia is a professor of clinical psychology in the School of Psychology, Speech and Hearing at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And that's where you are right now, right, Julia?
That's correct. Yes, I'm in Christchurch in my office.
Beautiful. Yeah. So she is also the director of Te Puna Toyota. Is that
Not bad. Te Puna Toyota.
Toyota, like Toyota, but with an R.
It's hard. A lot of the words are very hard to pronounce.
And that is the Mental Health and Nutrition Research Lab at the University of Canterbury. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you do is research, like true scientific, double-blind, placebo-controlled research on nutrition for brain health. Would you say that's correct?
That is right. So we explore the very simple idea that nutrition is relevant to your brain. And I mean, some ways that you could do that, but it's actually very hard to do, is that you get people to change their diets, which we know, and get people to report on what they're eating and how nutrient dense that food is, and you could explore that via different scientific methods. But we take the approach of saying, okay, let's just give people extra minerals and vitamins. We know how important minerals and vitamins are for brain health. There's so much understanding on their role, and their crucial role in neurotransmission, in helping your mitochondria make ATP, which is important for energy production, important for gut function, important for your DNA in terms of assisting with producing things called methyl groups, which we know assist with turning genes on and off. So really quite a wide variety of different functions that are essential. So we just through our research, we look at people who have been either given the micronutrients or given a placebo. They're all blind to it, and we look to see whether or not after exposure to the different condition they're in, whether that's had any positive effect on their overall brain health. And by that we would be looking mostly at psychiatric challenges like ADHD or mood or stress, that kind of thing.
Yes, and you have seen extremely powerful results. I mean, it's almost like, obviously, nutrition plays a huge role to brain health, but then it's not that obvious, right? Considering that medical schools don't teach this, and they actually teach you that they have marginal effects, and the way to deal with mental illness is to fix the chemical imbalance in the brain. And yeah, tell me what your thoughts are about the chemical imbalance hypothesis about brain health.
Right. Well, so I did it my first degree at McGill University in Montreal, and I did it in neuroscience, neurobiology specifically. And so it was at a time in the late 1980s when Well, Prozac came on the market in 1987. There had been other antidepressants before that, but Prozac really, was viewed as a blockbuster, as a life-changing drug that we thought would be able to cure depression. And it was exciting as a student studying the idea that all you had to do was correct what looked like, they assumed there was a chemical imbalance, and that you could fix depression and other serious psychiatric illnesses. So it was an incredibly compelling story, and that was logical, but the downside is that they never actually proved that there was a chemical imbalance to start with. So there's never been a study that has shown that people who are depressed have some kind of a serotonin deficiency relative to people who aren't depressed. So although the story was quite enticing, there was never any proof that there was a chemical imbalance. We do know that these drugs, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, do have an effect on your brain. There's no doubt about that. We know that from the experiences that people have. We know that from animal studies. We know that they're having an impact at the neurotransmitter level in the synapse, which is where the transmission goes from one neuron to another. So we do know that happens, but what correcting a chemical imbalance is very, very unlikely to be the causal explanation of why those drugs are having the effect that they do.
Yes, and you said in your book you talk about how um, how antidepressants often make. There's a study that showed that antidepressants actually increase the prevalence of bipolar disorder.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really worrying effect. Again, it's often been explained that it uncovers that when you get an antidepressant, it's often explained to patients that when they go manic, that the reason why they go manic is because it was it was part of the progression of their illness. Whereas in fact, it does seem like people who are given the antidepressants, it seems to have an influence around increasing the chances that you're going to then have a manic episode. So it's very worrying that there are these experiences that people are having, but often that they're not believed that it's actually something that may very much relate to the drug that they're taking. We like to see pharmaceuticals as being, amazing cures for things, but we do also have to acknowledge that they have severe limitations. And one of them might be that it increases the chances of other problems occurring, but another very real experience is that when you stop them, people can really, really struggle with the withdrawal of coming off of those drugs.
Absolutely, yeah. You familiar with Dr. Kelly Brogan?
Yes.
Her work. She wrote a book called The Mind of Your Own,
Mm,
which is really, really an amazing eye opener
mm,
about psychotropic medication and the way these drugs are studied and the way they are proved to be used. And on the other hand of that comes the nutrition aspect of things,
mm.
which thank you so much for your work. And I am so glad that you're able to get funding for your work as well, because I know that most studies are funded by something that is going to be profitable. And
Right.
nutrition is not necessarily going to be profitable for a pharmaceutical industry, right? So
That's right.
so this makes it very tricky in order to get funding. And
Exactly.
this is what's also interesting is this goes as deep as the medical schools. In your book, you said while in graduate school, and you were referring to Bonnie when you said we were
Mm,
barely taught about nutrition, and the few hours that were spent taught us that nutrition was not relevant for mental health,
mm,
and that psychiatric symptoms were manifestations of chemical balances in the brain that could only be corrected with medications. I kind of brought this
Yeah.
up before, and we
Yeah.
talked about that a bit. When it comes to research and you getting funding for your research on nutrients, which thank you so much for doing this
Mm.
research and showing that the efficacy is just far greater. Well, you know what, let's talk about the efficacy of broad spectrum micronutrients
Mm.
in comparison to some of the psychiatric medications, and I'll let you decide which
Yeah.
medications you want to compare with.
Yeah, it's very hard to do a sort of an absolute, one against the other, just to make that really clear. But I can give you some insights into what we've observed. So our studies have typically, when we're looking to see about efficacy, the way you do that is, as I was describing before, is you do a blind trial and you have some people taking the nutrients and some people take a placebo, and that allows you to control for a whole host of other reasons why people get better. And they do get better. Oftentimes, people do get better in clinical trials. And that may have nothing to do with the nutrients. It's got to do with the care that we give them, the fact that we are interested in them. We follow them, very, reliably over time. And so having that care of a clinician is incredibly therapeutic. So I don't want to undermine that effect. And that's why you have to do these clinical blinded trials. So we find that about 50 term trial, we have about 50% very reliably getting better. And
I
this is,
interrupt you for a moment because there was a
yeah.
little like glitchiness there when you were saying the percentages. So
Oh, okay. Say
go
it
ahead
again.
and say that again.
Okay, so in these very short-term clinical trials, we find that about 50% of those who were randomized to the active ingredients, that is the micronutrients, uh, are identified as being much to very much improved, whereas our placebo response is more close to about 20-25%. And it depends on the trial, so those numbers can vary a little bit, but that's about what we're seeing and observing. So you have about half of them doing very well in a very short period, a fairly short period of time, because you can't do blinded trials forever and ever or for a year or so. Now, our experience with micronutrients, though, is that in that 8 weeks, we're only starting to see the beginning of an effect. So over a much longer period of time, if people are exposed and take the nutrients over, say, a year, they are doing much, much better than they were after that 8 weeks. So after 8 weeks, they were doing well, but you see them a year later, and they kind of reflect on it and go, well, wow, compared to how I was just after we finished the trial, I'm even better. And they'll remark on all the different changes that have happened for them. So that at that point, after a year, they might be, noting that, well, at this point, they're usually in remission, typically in remission fully of whatever the condition was that we were treating them. And in most of our trials, we've been targeting ADHD, although not exclusively. Um, so they'll not only be in a remission of ADHD, but they'll notice that, say, for example, if they're children, they're academically on track now, whereas you wouldn't have been able to see that after 8 weeks, that kind of a change. So when you ask about, well, how does that compare to medication? Well, if you say take ADHD, which is something we're really familiar with something like the main treatment that's given for ADHD is a stimulant, what we call stimulant medications. It's not a great name for them, but that's that's the class name. Things like Ritalin, atomoxephene would be examples of a stimulant medication, or medications used to treat ADHD. So those medications work really quickly. You'll see an effect within maybe 3 or 4 hours, depends on, if it's a short-acting, long-acting version that you're giving. So you're going to see an immediate effect on ADHD symptoms. We don't see that often with nutrients. It's a much slower, gradual benefit over time, whereas with your stimulants, you get this benefit, and then you get withdrawal, and you get this return of the symptoms, and you get this kind of like flow up and down in control of symptoms. With the nutrients, it's slow, but once you reach the benefit in terms of control of symptoms, it stays there. You don't have the dipping in the withdrawal that you experience with stimulants. So if you're looking for a constant control of symptoms, the nutrients are going to trump the other medications that are used for the treatment of ADHD. But if you're looking at something that's going to change it within a few hours, well, then stimulants are going to be a better option. But then in our studies, what we've been able to do is compare children at the 1-year follow-up. At that stage, some people have decided to stay on nutrients, some have decided to go for medications. Oftentimes the reason why they switch to medications is because in New Zealand, medications are paid for and nutrients aren't. Now, in the United States, I suspect things are a bit different. But typically, our insurance companies are going to fund a drug, but they don't fund nutrients. So if you're in a financially compromised situation where you can't afford them, then typically people go back to the drugs. So then we get this naturalist opportunity of saying, okay, how are the kids at 1 year doing when they're still on nutrients? And how do they compare to kids who are now medicated? And absolutely, we see far better and greater benefit in the kids who are on nutrients compared to those who are on medication. So that's a very long answer. Sorry, you can't do it very simply because we've never done a head-to-head, and I don't ever think we'll ever be able to do a head-to-head type of trial, for the reasons that if you did a head-to-head trial, people who are going into your research would have to agree to either get randomized to medication or to nutrients. And we know that people have preferences, and if they end up getting randomized to, say, the one they didn't want to be randomized to, they're very likely to drop out of your trial. You see the problem? So while it'd be nice to be able to do those head-to-head comparisons in a true randomized way, chances are that it'd be a very, very hard trial to conduct. So that's why that kind of trial hasn't been done. And that's why we can only rely on these more naturalistic observations that we've made.
Thank you so much for that perspective. That perspective, I never really thought of, like, if I was randomized to be in the drug trial, like, I just wouldn't do it. I'd be like, no, out. But that's me personally, right? And perhaps the other way around with others, right?
Exactly. The other way around might happen as well. So that's why it's difficult. So you have to use other ways of trying to determine whether or not one is better than the other. But another way, though, that you can sort of do a comparison, but again, not perfect, is that you can look at our outcomes, which is about 50% after a short period of time, although much better. We have a much better response rate over that much longer period of time. You can compare that to how people are doing on antidepressants over a long period of time. And I can assure you, when we've looked at that, I am stunned by the number of people who are on antidepressants who are still depressed. And if I was somebody taking an antidepressant after several years and I was still depressed, I would hope I would be questioning why I was on this medication. But unfortunately, they end up in a catch-22, because if they stop the medication, they get even worse because of withdrawal. And so then they choose to stay on it because that's better than having to experience the withdrawal effect. So you end up really in a stuck situation. Nutrients do not do that. Nutrients, if you wanted to stop your nutrients, go ahead, stop them. You won't go into withdrawal. You may find that over time, you're not as resilient, you're not as, maybe your sleep isn't as good, you might be more fatigued because we know the nutrients help with energy. You might start to notice those things. Maybe you're not coping as well, you might be a bit grumpier over time, but you definitely won't experience things like brain zaps or massive increase in anxiety or irritability that you do experience, and certainly for some people much more serious symptoms when they come off of medications. So you definitely don't experience that when you come off off nutrients.
Right. Right. What we talk about a lot on this podcast is empowerment. Actually, before I
Mm,
talk about that, I did want to say that the USA also, we're not covering nutrients.
mm,
It's insurance is covering drugs mainly.
yeah.
Um, at least to my knowledge, and hopefully I'm wrong, but that last I checked, that was the case.
Mm,
So on this podcast, and I speak so much about empowerment. What can we do to give ourselves the best opportunity to live an awesome life?
mm,
And this is where nutrition really, it's the reason why How to Feed a Brain is the first book I wrote, because I could control what I was ingesting. And like you said, not easily. It's like it takes some responsibility to do that. And that's
mm,
what empowerment's all about. It's being responsible, because with great power comes great responsibility, right? But
mhm,
with great responsibility comes great power too. And
mm,
that's that's what I love about just following the nutrient thing. And as far as medication goes, are we going to be dependent on a medication for the rest of our lives? Because largely that's how it's played out. Like, how long are you supposed to be on your antidepressant? For the rest of your life. How long are you supposed to be on your statin? For the rest of your life.
rest of your life.
Right.
Mm,
And it's like, that's not what I want. I want to remove my dependence on drugs. And that's where I really appreciate your book, your research, looking into how to empower yourself. So
exactly. No, I like that word empowerment because I think that's very much what our research hopefully empowers people to do, which is that, yes, we've got the nutrient research. Yes, there are probably lots of good reasons why some people may need to take the additional nutrients in a pill form. But our first message in the book is food first.
yeah,
And so empowering people to see how important it is, whatever, every time you take a bite of food, you're making a choice to either feed yourself something that's going to be nourishing or feed yourself something that might feel good right now, but is definitely not going to be good for your brain.
right,
So to get people to understand how important those decisions are, and it's not just decisions that we make for ourselves, but they're also decisions that we make for our children and our unborn children. So there's that wider context as well. And so, or we could even think about it in terms of communities, that we are, if you just look around, unfortunately, in poorer communities, you end up with these food swamps, and it's that, which means that they're surrounded by Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's and Burger King and all of those, and those
yeah,
fast food
grocery
outlets
grocery
that are
stores,
just,
mostly chips and crackers,
yeah, that are compounding the
don't have the
problem.
produce that we that we want to see as much. We're very limited produce.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, how are yeah, I want to ask you how are well, actually, before I do, uh, the research that is done on pharmaceutical drugs largely is done in a manner where it's basically, like you said, quick response to something. Like, and our medicine in general is so good at acute care, at immediate
Hmm.
changes. When it comes to chronic conditions, and nutrition based, uh, or nutrition influenced diseases such as diabetes, Alzheimer's, honestly, uh, hypothyroidism issues, and I could go on and on and on. When
Mhm.
it comes to that, not so great at solving problems, at restoring health.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. We
So
need to look at other solutions, not the
right,
pharmacy.
and the pharmacy, I think it was Kelly Brogan who gave me this analogy as far as like understanding how research is done for psychotropic medications is pretty similar to something like this. Like, hey, getting some group of people with social anxiety, being like, all right, so half of you are going to be in the controlled group. We're going to give you uh, 2 shots of water. And this other group, we're going to give you 2 shots of vodka. And we're going to see what happens to your social anxiety. And clearly, the alcohol group has less social anxiety because their brain's inhibited.
Hmm.
Um, and then it's like drawing these conclusions that okay, well, we got to give people shots of vodka every day for the rest of their life. And we might even want to prophylactically give it to people as well.
Yeah.
Give prophylactically to your children just to be safe. And obviously that's not helping the problem. And that's where nutrition, which is simply supplying what our brain metabolism, what our body metabolism, what our existence usually like needs, the nutrients that we function with for our health is far superior.
Mm.
So and that shows in your research, which I know there's not a whole lot of because of the reasons we talked about with funding. So I am
Mhm.
so appreciative that you're doing this research.
And it's also important just to point out that none of our funding comes from the people who make the nutrient products that we've studied. It's completely independent. So that makes it even more challenging because often drug trials get their funding from the pharmaceutical industry, which puts an inherent bias in the interpretation of the results oftentimes.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about how mental health uh, conditions are categorized.
Okay. All
How,
right. How are they categorized? I mean, are you talking about, are you asking me to
I mean,
explain it traditionally?
how does a mental health condition become a mental health condition?
Okay. I mean, your question would be answered very differently depending on who you ask. I mean, if you think about it traditionally, if you think about somebody who's gone through a traditional, conventional type of training as a mental health professional, so a psychologist like myself, clinical psychologist, or a psychiatrist, or there's other mental health professionals as well who get trained in that diagnosis of conditions, then you would use, particularly in the United States, you'd use what's called the DSM, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And you would be people often will present not because they have they think they have a specific disorder. They present because they have symptoms. They're struggling, so they might be struggling with, say, panic attacks, or they might be just struggling because they can't get out of bed and they're feeling really low, or they're feeling suicidal or withdrawn. And then the clinician will ask a lot of questions, and it based on the number of symptoms that you endorse, you might meet criteria for a major depressive disorder, or an anxiety disorder, or social anxiety disorder. So that's how it's done. It's not done with a blood test. It's not done with any kind of biomarker or any other test that you often have for identifying some physical illnesses, like if you wanted to find out if someone has diabetes and you're looking at their insulin levels, for example. We don't have that, so it's based on the clinician report. Um, Now, depending on who you ask, I mean, people think that these diagnostic categories are really solid and reliable and valid. But I think there's been a lot of more challenges of these diagnostic categories in the more recent years. they I still find them useful in that it allows you to communicate very quickly a constellation of symptoms. So if you say somebody has ADHD, for example, then most people would go, oh yeah, okay, so that's somebody who struggles with attention and hyperactivity and or impulsivity, and that's impairing them to a certain degree that they have this diagnosis. So it does have some level of usefulness, but we also know that these conditions aren't, even though the manual is suggesting that these conditions are unique, and that they don't overlap. They do. I mean, there's a lot of grayness across the different conditions, and grayness about whether or not you're one thing versus another thing. So I worry that we've gone down this pathway of having these conditions that are simply descriptions or names that are given for a description of a bunch of symptoms, when human life isn't really, our experiences aren't really, they don't fall into these wonderful boxes, or what look like really useful boxes. So I do worry that we put these human conditions and normal experiences into these what looks like a disorder. So I don't know what you were quite going for with your question.
That's awesome. And I think that's really great point, is that diagnosis based on symptom, which honestly, this kind of reminds me of also digestive issues like irritable bowel syndrome, right? IBS.
Mm, yeah.
It's like you go to your doctor, you say, "Oh, doctor, my bowel, it's so irritable right now." You go, "Well, you have irritable bowel syndrome." Like you've
Mm,
hit the symptoms of it, and that's where the label is then placed on there. And I was
yeah.
thinking about diagnostic statistical manual, and thinking about what you said with the diagnosis being symptom based. So
Mm,
thinking about that title, this is the diagnosis, the diagnostic, if the symptoms are statistically like point to this. So the symptoms, statistically, this handful of symptoms point to this diagnosis. Would you say that's accurate?
well, I mean, you could say that it's reliable in that if different people saw those same symptoms, they might all say the same thing. But in terms of the usefulness of that category, it's only useful if it's, say, for example, absolutely tells us how we're going to treat it, which it doesn't very well. And it doesn't necessarily help us understand why it developed, because the DSM isn't about telling us the etiology of the cause of why somebody is struggling. So the reason why somebody ends up expressing those symptoms varies greatly from individual to individual. So for one person, it may well be that one very common cause of the expression of a lot of symptoms is trauma, and that something's happened, and that's what leads to the expression of anxiety or moodiness or other psychiatric like problems. But it is, to pathologize trauma really, it's certainly irks me, and I know it's starting to irk a lot of people that that's what we're doing. Um, and trauma could be a lot of different things. I mean, and it could be, even the effect of colonization. Colonization is a form of historical trauma that can have a huge impact on huge communities, like ethnic communities. So again, why are we pathologizing something that settlers did to the indigenous people of a country? I mean, that's going to be relevant in the United States, certainly relevant in New Zealand with Maori, and relevant in Canada. So it's something that's and yet we just, all what we do is we say, we look at the statistics and we say, oh well, there's twice as many Maori who are depressed compared to non-Maori. And that all that's to me says is, well, that's because there's greater deprivation. They're more likely to be poor. They're more likely to have experienced racism. They're more likely to have colonization, trauma associated with colonization, et cetera, et cetera. So why are we putting, I mean, you're getting into quite, philosophical and social issues, but why are we then putting them into a category of abnormality?
Yeah. Yeah. And abnormality being a physiological basis
Mm.
of things. And as you said, it's symptom based, not physiologically based. And we can have the same symptoms from just different
Yeah,
physiological
yeah,
imbalances or
yeah. I
disturbances.
mean, exactly. So for others, it might be nutrient deficiencies because
Hmm.
they don't eat good food, or for others, it could have be completely different. So the expression of symptoms, in terms of the etiology of the expression of symptoms, is going to vary a lot.
Yes. Yes. And so with nutrients, we're actually affecting the physiology of the brain. We're actually giving the brain the nutrients needed. And
Yeah,
we're affecting the physiology in all of the
yeah,
medications as well. But it's
absolutely.
we're basically restoring the function of our normal physiology rather than rather than changing some chemical balance in the brain
Mm.
and seeing what happens essentially.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's certainly what we hope to be doing. It's we started exploring this in some of the research that we've been doing here, which is to say, okay, we know these nutrients have a positive effect on lots of people, and it's all very important for your listeners to know that it's not everybody. There are people who have taken the nutrients where we so change tend not to make people worse, which is a good thing, but there are people who don't benefit at all, and we're always trying to figure out why that is. But we've also been exploring about, well, is there some biological change that can help us understand the clinical observations? And so our lab has explored this a little bit, and we're going to do more and more of this work over the next couple of years. But one study, which I'm really excited about, that we published a couple of years ago, we looked at the microbiome of kids with ADHD, with those, at least that symptom profile, um, of having those symptoms associated with ADHD, and we looked at the kids who were on micronutrients compared to kids who took the placebo, and we looked at we got fecal samples, so before and after the exposure to either the nutrients or placebo. And what we observed in a small sample, so I have to always say this needs to be replicated. But what was exciting was that we saw an increase in the diversity of the bacteria that are in the microbiome. And if we assume that diversity is important, which there's a lot of evidence that's starting to suggest that that is the case, then that's really exciting that the micronutrients are having that kind of an effect on the microbiome. And so if that gets replicated, it might point to one of the things that nutrient-dense food is doing, which is ensuring that we support a diverse microbiome, lots of different bacteria, because there's no special bacteria. Just like there's no special nutrient, there's probably no special bacteria. So having a diverse microbiome is going to be important. So that was an exciting discovery. And we've looked at, I was talking right at the beginning of the podcast, was around one of the things that we think we know micronutrients do for the brain is assist with methylation, which is the production of these methyl groups. And a methyl group is just simply a carbon with 3 hydrogens around it. And they are incredible molecules because they have the power to turn genes on and off, the presence of lots of these methyl groups. And so you can measure this now, remarkably, with technology, and look at how whether or not the micronutrients are increasing methylation, so the increasing the production of these methyl groups. And we got some signals. Again, small sample, we need to replicate it, but there were these signals that showed that it does look like we are indeed producing more methyl groups. So having that biological evidence is wonderful, and particularly wonderful to counter skeptics who often say, "Oh, micronutrients are just expensive urine," and I'm like, well, no, they're not, because the placebo-controlled trials show greater benefit with those taking the nutrients. But we now also have some biologically observed changes that give us a bit more confidence about what we've been saying of why we think these nutrients are beneficial to individuals.
So a methyl group can attach to a cell or neuron or whatever, and through a chemical bonding, it's
Mm-hmm.
going to change how the DNA is expressed.
Mm-hmm. Or regulated. Oftentimes they like to call it talk about gene regulation.
And what
And
does that
so
mean exactly?
and
I
it just
know
and
you're
it's
not a geneticist.
yes, but it means, I mean, I mean, your term is useful as well. Expression, gene expression. So that means that genes code for proteins that are important for biological chemical reactions to occur in your body. So if you want these proteins to be made because they're important they'll be important potentially for the chemical reactions that lead to the manufacture of serotonin, for example. So you want these proteins potentially to be made, but I don't want to make it sound like uh, having proteins made is necessarily a good thing. In some cases, that is not a good thing. So it's neither good nor bad of having genes get turned on or off. So that's been very clearly explained to me by geneticists, is that it's not a good or bad thing, but that gene regulation and allowing the methylation process to occur means that some proteins can be made that weren't being made, and some proteins that were being made won't be made, and that may or may not be a good thing. So it's complicated, and but overall, we think that that's useful. This methylation process is useful for producing things that are going to be important ultimately for some of these brain activities.
And what is the research on methylation in some of these drugs?
I don't know. Do you?
I know that some drugs, and I don't know the exact specifics, but
Yeah.
inhibit the methylation cycle. Some drugs may deplete certain
Yeah.
certain
Nutrients.
vitamins, and usually you need B
Yeah.
vitamins
That's
and
right.
other
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that
vitamins.
way, but I suppose we do know that medications can deplete nutrients.
Nutrients, right?
And we know things like statins can have an effect on particularly the production of ATP because they affect coenzyme Q10. Um, so I guess it would. Yeah, that makes sense that it would affect they could potentially affect the methylation cycle because there's fewer B vitamins available.
Yeah, so you don't do that sort of research on drugs. You take people that are already on the drugs and and you'll compare those things.
You raise a good question, which is, in fact, in our studies that we've done here in New Zealand, Bonnie's involved in some studies where people are on drugs, but none of the studies that we've done in New Zealand are people on drugs when they come into our research study. So they have to be medication free in order to get into the study. And this is really, really key important thing for your listeners to know, which is that the reason why we do that is that it's incredibly well documented by physicians and psychiatrists who use the nutrients that we study, is that there's drug nutrient interactions. And we talk about this in the book. And one of the biggest challenges is people who are already on drugs. What we think, and it's kind of, at this stage, it's just hypotheses, but when you feed the brain appropriately, you can end up being over medicated. And so you end up with a worsening of your symptoms if you are on a drug. And so the drug needs to be tapered down, and in order to have the best response.
So when somebody's taking a drug and then they have nutrient depletion or they're introducing other nutrients, that
Mm,
affects the way the drug
yeah.
is utilized in the body,
Metabolized.
is
Yeah.
metabolized in the body.
Yeah.
If somebody's deficient in a certain nutrient, they can be they can have an inappropriate dose as a result of
Exactly.
either being
Because it
go ahead.
changes the whole balance system of your body. So you end up being oftentimes the way it's described is you end up being over medicated. You end up with the nutrients seem to well the nutrients if we think about it from a work backwards the nutrients we think we good evidence nutrients are involved as cofactors in the manufacture of serotonin and dopamine, all these neurotransmitters. So you're giving the building blocks of those neurotransmitters, so then there's potentially more of it, although we haven't actually been able to test that specifically. It'd be very, very hard to do, but that would be the the that would be the expected outcome. Then you've got a drug that is affecting the serotonin effect, neurotransmission, and we know that that's what it does. So you can end up with it getting imbalanced potentially at the neurotransmitter level, and at the synaptic level, and then you can see why you end up being feeling a sense of being over medicated. That's my guess, but it's probably not the whole story, and we have yet to unravel it. But the clinical observation is that if you add these nutrients at the doses that we're giving, now it's important for your listeners to know this is not a supermarket variety multivitamin.
Mhm.
These we in some of our studies we give up people up to 12 pills a day, which is a really compacted mineral vitamin in each one of those capsules, not in super mega doses, but certainly higher than what you get out of a supermarket multivitamin. So it probably wouldn't happen with a multivitamin, but then a multivitamin from a supermarket is hardly going to have probably an effect in any capacity. It might stop you from getting scurvy or rickets, but that's probably about it. Which are just nutritional deficiencies that we've pretty much eradicated.
That for a moment.
Yep.
So a lot of the supplements, the multivitamins, are giving you the RDA, the recommended daily
Yeah.
allowance, right? Which is far less than optimal for our
Our
our bodies,
brain.
our metabolism,
Yeah.
where it is pathological ranges mostly. And it's like this is the least amount you can get
Yeah.
before you have a nutritional deficiency
Mm.
that has been
Yeah.
studied and laid out.
Yeah, so RDAs are, I mean, your listeners will probably be familiar with RDAs because I think they're on packages of food and they'll say how much, RDA or vitamin C might be in there. They're often really low and they're often way below 100%. But the major challenge that I have with the RDAs is that it's giving people this target that they think if I just hit 100%, sorry, with
Mm.
my daily
But
intake of my nutrients, then I'm going to be fine. And RDAs were developed in the 1940s in order to ensure that we adequately fed our troops at war. And so that would be ensuring that they were physically fit to fight. It didn't have anything to do with what was important for the brain. And acknowledging that the brain is the most metabolically hungry organ of the body, then we can assume that RDA is not going to be what's adequate for your brain health. And so we've been misled by these numbers for decades, thinking that we were doing the right thing by just hitting that minimal amount. But at the same time, we're just starving our brains. So that's overall not being a good thing. So I'm not a big fan of the RDAs because I think they they mislead the public into assuming that all you need are studies. So going back to our studies, when we give 12 pills a day, we are giving it above RDA,
mm,
not in a dose that's toxic. It's not, and it's certainly not something that people should be frightened by. Although they often are because they're so focused on these RDAs that we've been brainwashed into thinking is the dose we need. But at levels that are probably far more adequate for meeting the nutritional requirements of the brain. So that's the sort of the difference in that story.
Yes. And this is where I want to talk with you about your broad spectrum micronutrients that you're studying, not yours. You are not funded by these guys.
Correct. Yep.
You're studying the nutrient profile in the, I mean, they are products that are on the market, but you're not being funded by them. They're
Mm-hmm.
just a not a multivitamin, but a broad spectrum micronutrient.
Mm.
And so while
Mineral and vitamin.
mineral and vitamins, so it has minerals and vitamins that your over-the-counter multivitamin does not have.
Correct. Well, it has, first of all, it has probably a greater breadth because those multivitamins that are sold in the supermarket often don't have all the minerals that are essential for your brain. They miss them out. But they're in a dose that's going to be far better, far higher, and what you're in a level that your brain is going to require, as opposed to what might be useful for your heart or your bones or that the other organs. And I'm trying to think. There's going to say something else, but I'm lost. I forgot it. It's gone.
No worries, no worries. So how do you know what amount is crucial for brain
Mm.
metabolism?
Yeah, that is hard to establish, and part of it is established because we've done the experiments, and so we've done this with using different doses in some of our research, so that you sort of get a sense that this seems to be the dose that where most people do well. Not everyone necessarily. Some people might need more, some people might need less because we are nutritionally different, or our nutritional requirements could be different. How much zinc I need might be different from the amount of zinc that you need. But overall, we can get some pretty good ideas of what's sort of probably an optimal dose for most people. It's important to know that in the book, we describe all the different supplements that have been studied for brain health. We list them in a chapter. We go through, these are the ones that we are aware of that have the research to back them for supporting some level of brain health. And it might be because, a B vitamin complex has been studied for stress. Then we've named all of them. We've named them all in the book. Um, and as you say, we're not wedded to any particular brand. We just are studying the idea. And the way you study that idea that nutrition is relevant to the brain is you have to have a formula. So that, and I'm not a developer of formula, I'm a psychologist. And so I'm not going to go, that's certainly not what I'm going to waste a whole bunch of years of my career doing, which is to come up with the perfect formula. So I use what other people have come up with. And in particular, the nutrient formula that we've studied comes directly from Alberta, Canada, which is where I did my PhD with Bonnie. And I'm sure Bonnie, if you interviewed her, would have told
Yeah.
you all of the story and background to that. And that's also, we did talk about it in the book as well.
Yes, yes. And the book, I think it just came out, or it's,
April 20th.
yeah, it's April
So it
20th.
depends on
Depends on
when
when
you're
you
going
say.
to put this
So it's
podcast.
called The Better Brain. And you're saying that you actually go into some of the nutrients, how much is optimal for, and optimal, that word kind of, I know I used it in my book, but it's still like, it's a word that is so dependent
Mm.
on you as a individual.
Mm.
Like, all of us are bio individual.
Yeah,
We all have different chemical makeups.
yeah,
What Dr. David Hasse calls the soup. It's like how our how our physiology is made up. What's going on in our bodies? What's going on in there? And we're all different.
yeah. And also,
Go ahead.
exactly. And you mentioned you had a traumatic brain injury. And so a traumatic brain injury is I would imagine and understand that it would, in order to try to heal your brain from something like that, you would need more nutrients than someone else because you're trying to treat an underlying difference that maybe someone who didn't have a TBI wouldn't have. if you are older, so if you are people who are in their 80s, they have nutritional needs that are going to be different from somebody in their 20s. If you're pregnant, you're going to have different nutritional needs. If you're a teenager, teenagers are, I describe in the book, their brains under reconstruction, so they need a lot of nutrients in order for that to assist with the brain development, particularly of the frontal lobes. So we do have these differences. Women who are maybe going through menopause, or even if we talk a little bit about it in the book, some of the research we did in my lab on women who have PMS, a premenstrual syndrome, is that can influence your nutritional needs at a certain time of the month. So if you take medications, we talk about that, that can deplete your nutrients, and so you may need more nutrients. You might be eating food that isn't nutritionally rich, so your nutritional needs may be higher. So there's a whole host of reasons that we really wanted, we spent a lot of time in the book trying to explain that there are these individual differences. Or if you're stressed, stress is something I'm near and dear to my heart, because we've dealt with a lot of stress and trauma in Christchurch, and I think that definitely increases your need for nutrition to help you be more resilient to deal with and cope with chronic stress, because the fight flight response is nutritionally hungry. It takes everything, and there's very little left for your regulation of your mood or your sleep or your anxiety. So we need more at times of stress, and unfortunately what we tend to do is reach for comfort foods at a time of stress, so that's just not going to adequately feed your brain.
Yes, and this is the other part of empowerment, is like it gets a little complicated. It's so bio-individual that it really comes down to your awareness of yourself, in of how you're feeling, how your mood is, how your actions
Yeah,
are, kind of keeping
exactly.
track of what's working and what's not. And
Yeah, and I think what's wonderful is what this book hopefully empowers people to do is that there's a lot of things that are in their control that they can go into right now. They don't have to go see a doctor. They don't have to feel that they're under spell of a psychiatrist or other mental health professional that they must see in order to get better. That there are a lot of things that they can do themselves in order to heal.
yeah, yeah. So that aspect of being empowered is so important. I really appreciated how you talked about how nutrients affect the microbiome, and really, I mean, it makes sense. It's feeding the bacteria that's in there. They have all the nutrients they need. Um, at least the beneficial ones seem to just proliferate with, they seem to thrive in an environment that has the nutrients they need. So we have a very healthy gut microbiome as well, and we've talked a lot about how important the gut microbiome is to your health,
Mm,
and the nutrients for those microbiome is another piece of it, because
mm,
sometimes when the microbiome eats micronutrients, it then creates nutrients that weren't there.
mm,
Um, for example, what is it? Is it CLA? I think it's CLA, conjugated linoleic acid. No, it's butyrate. For example, butyrate is created from your gut microbiome to a large degree, from being from metabolizing. So as
mhm,
your microbiome is metabolized, so is your body with nutrients that they're not even getting from the food you're ingesting. So this is really, really cool stuff with
mhm,
your research and what you're doing for nutrition. It's really important to bring this awareness, and I say for nutrition as if it's a group, but for people to understand the importance of nutrition versus the importance of pharmaceuticals. So the book's called A Better Brain.
Exactly.
Yes. And I'm going to
Yep.
put links to A Better Brain. I'm also going to put links to these micronutrients. And I want you to listen to, I mean, check out this book. It's really an extremely useful tool for how to feed your brain. Much like my book is a great tool for how to feed your brain. So is Julia and Bonnie's book, and I'm just so appreciative for you guys creating doing the work you do. So
Well,
aligned.
thank you for bringing it to your listeners' attention, because that's the only way we're going to be able to change the world.
Well, we're on the same team for sure.
Yes.
On the other side of the globe, but on the same team.
Exactly.
Exactly. Thank you so much for everything you do, Julia.
Thank you.
And I'll have the links in the description. And oh, I did want to bring up one last thing, and
Yeah.
that's that you have a course on edX,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
it's a free course
Yes.
on edX. And what is
Yeah.
that, like a TED platform?
It sure sounds like a TED platform, but it's not. But I think they've used that kind of terminology
Makes
to get
sense.
probably some synergy there. So edX is a platform for free online courses that are done through universities across the world. It's, I think, originally based on some Harvard academics who put this together, and now other universities put courses on there, often to promote their university to get greater exposure on the global market. And so our University of Canterbury wanted to sort of test out using this edX platform. And so so I was one of the people who was approached to do a MOOC, which is called a Mass Online Open Access course. It's free to anybody to sign up, or if you want a certificate and you want to be a bit more challenged and do the readings and do the assessments, then you can pay, I think it's $150 and you can get a certificate at the end of it. So there's no obligation to do that. I think they do try to keep encouraging you, of course, to pay for that, but you can certainly ignore that and just watch the content. And I'm pretty thrilled about the content. We did 29 videos, interviewed lots of different people for it. They're very, they're tight, compact videos, trying to explain a lot of the concepts that we also explain in the book. So, but just in a different format. So if you like videos, then that's sort of another way to learn that information. So it started. We have at the moment 8,000 people enrolled in it. So that's pretty cool. And I think you can enroll in it for at least the next couple of months. And then I'm sure they probably put it on pause for a bit, and then they probably do it again. And so I suspect if people miss it this time around, they can do it in September is my guess, but I don't have control over that.
Well, cool. They can start right now,
Yeah.
and learn this stuff. Just go to the link. Also, will be
Great.
on
To
the page on the show notes.
Thank
Head over
you.
to adventuresinbraininjury.com
Hmm.
/ podcasts,
Great.
and this one should be at the top unless you're listening to it way later.
Okay.
And leave a comment, and we'll get back to that as well. So thank you guys so much, and thank you so much, Julia. It's really awesome to have a conversation with you, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Well, it's been lovely to meet you because I've heard a lot about you from Bonnie. So it's good to finally at least meet you in this virtual world.
That time, yeah. All right. Well, take care, and thank you
Okay.
all. See you next time.
Okay. Bye.
Someone take me to a doctor.